At first glance, your people seem to be doing surprisingly well. No one is badly hurt, there is still enough food to get through the next few days. The shelter keeps out the wind, and for now, everyone is alive. Nothing about the situation feels urgent, but the greatest danger facing your group isn't standing outside your camp. It's already inside it. Not as a predator, not as a storm, not as starvation, as time. Your community has only 23 people. Among them, just 11 are old enough to have children. When you look more closely, the choices become alarmingly small. Some of those adults are brothers and sisters. Others are first cousins. With every generation, the number of unrelated partners shrinks a little more, quietly pushing the group toward a problem that cannot be seen until its consequences begin to appear. This isn't a fictional scenario created to make the story more dramatic. It was one of the greatest long-term challenges every small prehistoric community had to solve. Unlike hunger or freezing temperatures, this threat didn't arrive overnight. It built itself slowly across generations, weakening a population from within until the damage became impossible to ignore. And yet, somehow, our ancestors avoided that fate. For hundreds of thousands of years, ancient humans kept their communities genetically healthy without knowing what DNA was. They had never heard the words gene, mutation, or recessive allele. They had no biology textbooks, no laboratories, and no understanding of how inherited disorders actually worked. Still, they found a solution. Not through science, but through behavior, through social rules, through traditions, through instincts shaped over countless generations. Together, these invisible systems solved one of evolution's most difficult practical problems and helped our species survive long before anyone understood why those solutions worked. So how did they do it? The answer reveals something remarkable about how intelligent ancient human societies truly were. Before we can understand how ancient humans escaped the dangers of inbreeding, we first need to understand why the danger existed in the first place. The solution only seems remarkable once you appreciate just how serious the biological problem really was. Every person alive today carries hidden genetic mutations. Most of them never cause any trouble because they exist in only one copy. The healthy version of the same gene quietly compensates for the damaged one, allowing a person to live an entirely normal life without ever realizing those mutations are there. This isn't unusual. In fact, it's completely normal. The human genome contains billions of DNA building blocks, and new mutations appear naturally in every generation. Most harmful mutations remain rare because natural selection gradually removes them whenever they are expressed. But before that happens, many of them continue to travel silently through families, passed from parent to child without producing any obvious symptoms. The problem begins when two closely related people have children together. Because relatives inherit much of the same DNA from shared ancestors, they are far more likely to carry the exact same hidden mutation. If both parents pass that damaged copy to the same child, what was once harmless can suddenly become a serious genetic disorder. The closer the relationship, the greater the risk. Parents and children or siblings share roughly half of their genetic material. First cousins share about 1/8. That may sound like a comfortable difference, but even that level of shared ancestry noticeably increases the chance that harmful recessive mutations will meet in the next generation. Scientists have documented the consequences for decades. Children born to closely related parents are, on average, more likely to experience developmental disorders, weakened immune systems, certain inherited diseases, and reduced overall health throughout life. These effects become even more severe when the same small population continues intermarrying over many generations. Harmful mutations accumulate, genetic diversity declines, and the entire community becomes less resilient to disease, environmental change, and other survival challenges. For a prehistoric band of only 20 or 30 people, this wasn't an abstract lesson from a biology textbook. It was a genuine survival problem. A community cut off from outside groups for just a handful of generations could begin showing the very genetic patterns that modern scientists associate with inbreeding. Archaeological discoveries and ancient DNA recovered from isolated island populations, communities trapped behind glaciers, and groups reduced by catastrophic events repeatedly reveal exactly these signatures of reduced genetic diversity. Looking back, the evidence tells a simple story. Groups that failed to solve this problem gradually disappeared. The ones that found a way to keep new genetic diversity flowing into their communities were the ones whose descendants ultimately survived. Personally, I think this is one of the easiest things to underestimate about ancient humans. We often picture them struggling against cold winters, hungry predators, or scarce food because those dangers are visible. But one of the greatest threats they faced couldn't be seen at all. all. It existed quietly inside every generation, hidden within their own families. Solving that invisible problem required something far more powerful than physical strength. It required behaviors that evolution had been shaping for an incredibly long time. That brings us to the first layer of humanity's defense. Long before people understood heredity, evolution had already begun building a biological safeguard directly into the human mind. The most remarkable example is something known as the Westermarck effect. First described by Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermarck in 1891, this theory proposes that children who grow up together during the earliest years of life naturally develop an unconscious aversion to becoming romantic or sexual partners later on. It isn't a moral lesson taught by parents, nor is it a cultural tradition learned from society. Instead, it appears to be an automatic psychological response triggered simply by sharing the same home during early childhood. From an evolutionary perspective, the mechanism makes perfect sense. In prehistoric family groups, the children growing up beside you were almost always your closest relatives. Rather than identifying genes directly, the brain relied on a much simpler cue: familiar faces inside the same household. Remarkably, modern research suggests this instinct works even when no biological relationship exists. One of the strongest examples comes from Israel's kibbutzim, where unrelated children raised together in communal groups from infancy almost never chose each other as romantic partners later in life. Despite sharing no genetic connection and facing no cultural prohibition, they consistently described one another as feeling more like siblings than potential mates. The opposite pattern is just as revealing. Adults who are biologically related but separated shortly after birth sometimes experience an unexpectedly strong attraction when they first meet decades later, a phenomenon psychologists call genetic sexual attraction. The contrast suggests that the brain is responding less to shared DNA than to shared childhood experience. For ancient humans, this instinct would have been operating every single day. Brothers, sisters, half-siblings, and cousins raised together inside the same camp naturally developed psychological barriers that discouraged reproduction between the closest relatives. No one needed to understand genetics. No one needed to calculate family trees. Evolution had already supplied the first line of defense, but that first line wasn't enough. A band of only 20 or 30 people still contained more distant relatives who had not necessarily grown up side by side, cousins from different family shelters. Second cousins, or relatives connected through earlier generations, could still reproduce without triggering this instinctive avoidance. If ancient humans were going to protect their communities over hundreds of thousands of years, biology alone couldn't solve the problem. They would need something even more sophisticated. The Westermarck effect gave ancient humans an important biological safeguard, but it could only do so much. It discouraged relationships between people who had grown up side by side. It couldn't protect a small community from the much larger problem of running out of unrelated partners altogether. That is where biology handed the problem over to culture. The most effective long-term solution was something anthropologists call exogamy, the practice of finding a reproductive partner from outside your own social group instead of within it. While the exact rules differed from one culture to another, the underlying principle remained remarkably consistent. Across virtually every traditional society that has been studied in depth, people were expected to build families beyond the boundaries of their own immediate community. This wasn't simply a custom or a social preference, it was a practical answer to a biological challenge. Personally, I think this is one of the moments where ancient humans become far more impressive than we usually give them credit for. We often imagine their greatest inventions as fire, stone tools, or hunting weapons. But some of their most important innovations couldn't be held in your hand. They were systems of cooperation, ideas that quietly protected future generations long before anyone understood why they worked. The strongest evidence comes from ancient DNA itself. Genetic studies of hunter-gatherer remains recovered across Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world consistently reveal levels of genetic diversity that simply shouldn't exist if these communities had remained reproductively isolated. Instead, scientists repeatedly find signs of continuous gene flow, the regular introduction of new genetic material from neighboring groups through reproductive partnerships. One particularly fascinating study examined the DNA of hunter-gatherers buried at a site in present-day Belgium dating to roughly 35,000 years ago. The genetic pattern suggested that many of the women buried there came from different ancestral populations than the men. In other words, women often left the communities where they were born and formed families with unrelated men living in neighboring groups, while men were more likely to remain within their birth communities. This pattern pattern, known as female exogamy, leaves a recognizable genetic signature that researchers can still detect tens of thousands of years later. It isn't speculation. It is preserved in the DNA of the people themselves. But recognizing the importance of marrying outside your group was only the beginning. Making that system work year after year required something much more difficult. It required connection, and connection required trust. Separate bands couldn't simply appear one day and begin exchanging sons and daughters. Relationships between communities had to be built, maintained, and protected across generations. In many ways, this invisible network became one of the greatest pieces of social technology ancient humans ever created. One of the most important mechanisms was periodic aggregation. Rather than living together permanently, multiple hunting bands gathered at specific places during seasons when food was unusually abundant. Massive salmon migrations, large game movements, or periods of exceptional plant harvest created opportunities for dozens of families to meet in the same location. Archaeologists have uncovered compelling evidence for these gatherings. Some prehistoric camps contained far more tools, hearths, food remains, and imported raw materials than a single band could reasonably produce. They also reveal communal feasting on a scale that points to many separate groups occupying the same landscape at the same time. These seasonal gatherings served many purposes. Alliances were renewed, disputes could be settled peacefully, knowledge was exchanged, stories traveled from one community to another, and just as importantly, young people met individuals they had never grown up with. A young man from one valley might spend days hunting beside a young woman from another. They shared no close family history, had never lived under the same roof, and therefore never developed the psychological barrier created by the Westermark effect. These gatherings became something far more significant than seasonal festivals. They became the prehistoric equivalent of a marriage network. If exogamy was the strategy, these gatherings were the mechanism that made it possible. The same principle extended across even greater distances through trade and gift exchange. Archaeologists have discovered valuable stone, shells, pigments, and other materials transported hundreds of kilometers from their original sources. Those objects weren't moving through empty landscapes by accident. They were traveling along relationships that had been maintained for years, sometimes generations. You don't entrust your daughter to complete strangers. You entrust her to a community your family has known for decades. A community that has exchanged gifts with yours, honored agreements, built mutual trust, and earned a reputation that everyone recognizes. Long before money existed, these exchanges created something even more valuable, a reliable bridge between separate human groups. Ancient trade, then, was never only about resources. It was the physical expression of social bonds. And those bonds quietly kept isolated communities from becoming genetically isolated as well. Over time, ancient societies strengthened these biological and social solutions with something even more powerful: rules. They developed increasingly sophisticated systems of kinship that clearly distinguished who counted as family, who did not, and who was considered an appropriate reproductive partner. Anthropologists have spent generations studying these kinship systems because they appear in every part of the world, despite enormous cultural differences. Perhaps the clearest example is the incest taboo. Every known human society prohibits sexual relationships between certain categories of close relatives, even though the exact boundaries differ from culture to culture. That remarkable universality strongly suggests the practice has extremely ancient origins. In many ways, the incest taboo acted as the cultural partner to the Westermark effect. Biology created an instinctive aversion among children raised together. Culture expanded that instinct into explicit social rules, reinforced by families and communities, ensuring that even situations where instinct alone might fail were still governed by collective expectations. Many societies went even further by establishing positive marriage rules. Instead of saying only who you could not marry, they also defined who you should marry. One of the best known examples is cross-cousin marriage, where marriage was encouraged between the children of a mother's brother or a father's sister, while marriage to parallel cousins, the children of two brothers or two sisters, was discouraged or forbidden. By modern genetic standards, this was hardly a perfect system. First cousins still share about 12.5% of their DNA, and their children face a higher probability of inheriting harmful recessive mutations than unrelated couples. But ancient humans weren't choosing between perfect and imperfect options. They were choosing between a manageable level of genetic risk and the far greater danger of remaining trapped inside an isolated community generation after generation. Seen from that perspective, these marriage systems weren't random traditions. They were practical social engineering, carefully balancing family alliances with the biological need to keep new genetic diversity flowing into the population. And perhaps that is the most remarkable lesson of all. Long before people understood genes, chromosomes, or DNA, they had already learned one of evolution's most important truths. A community survives not by closing itself off, but by staying connected to others. Now comes perhaps the strongest proof that ancient humans weren't simply getting lucky. Everything we've talked about so far, instincts, customs, seasonal gatherings, and marriage rules, sounds convincing, but does the evidence actually support it? Today, for the first time in human history, we can test those ideas directly. Ancient DNA has transformed archaeology. Instead of relying only on stone tools, campsites, or buried skeletons, scientists can now analyze the genomes of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Hundreds of ancient individuals from across Europe and other parts of Eurasia have already been studied, allowing researchers to reconstruct not only who these people were, but also how entire communities were connected. And the results are remarkably consistent. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers repeatedly show levels of heterozygosity, a scientific term that simply refers to how genetically diverse an individual's DNA is. Higher heterozygosity generally means more genetic variation and a healthier mix of inherited genes. If prehistoric communities had spent generation after generation reproducing only within their own tiny bands, those diversity levels should have dropped dramatically, but they didn't. Instead, ancient genomes reveal a continuous stream of new ancestry entering local populations. Individuals buried at the same archaeological sites often carried genetic components that were not shared equally with everyone around them, indicating that people from different communities continued joining these groups over thousands of years. Perhaps the clearest evidence comes from the same pattern we discussed earlier. At multiple prehistoric sites, researchers found that mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line, shows greater diversity than expected within a community, while Y chromosome lineages remain comparatively stable. In simple terms, many women came from different maternal families, while many men stayed where they were born. That is exactly the genetic fingerprint scientists would expect if women regularly left their birth communities to form families elsewhere. It's one thing to imagine such a system. It's another to see its signature preserved inside DNA after tens of thousands of years. Of course, ancient DNA also records the opposite story. Researchers do occasionally find genetic signs of inbreeding, including long runs of homozygosity, repeated stretches of nearly identical DNA inherited from both parents, as well as elevated levels of shared ancestry between individuals buried together. But these cases are surprisingly uncommon compared with what scientists would expect from permanently isolated populations. When they do appear, they usually occur under exceptional circumstances: island communities, groups trapped by glaciers or difficult geography, populations reduced to only a handful of survivors after catastrophic events. In other words, these are situations where maintaining contact with neighboring communities became extraordinarily difficult. Looking across the entire archaeological record, however, a much larger pattern emerges. Ancient humans did not stumble into genetic diversity by accident. They protected it, generation after generation, community after community. They built social systems that consistently reduced the risk of inbreeding long before anyone understood the biology behind it. Personally, I think this changes the way we should think about prehistoric intelligence. Intelligence isn't only measured by inventing a better spear or discovering fire. Sometimes it appears in something much quieter: the ability to build traditions that continue solving problems for descendants you will never live to meet. There is another part of this story that deserves far more attention: the women who made this entire system possible. In many traditional societies practicing exogamy, it was usually young women, not men, who left their birth communities when they reached reproductive age. Anthropologists refer to this pattern as patrilocal residence, where men remain in their home community while women move to live with their partner's family. Ancient DNA recovered from multiple prehistoric sites suggests that this arrangement has extraordinarily deep roots. But behind that scientific pattern is a very human experience. Imagine growing up surrounded by the same faces your entire life. Every path through the forest is familiar. Every elder knows your name. Every childhood memory belongs to that place. Then, sometime in your late teens or early adulthood, you leave. Not for a short journey, for a completely different community. A place where almost every every face is unfamiliar, where customs may be slightly different, where trust has to be earned instead of assumed, where your future family is waiting among people who, only months before, were complete strangers. That was an enormous transition. It required far more than simply choosing a partner. It meant building an entirely new social life while adapting to a different community, finding your place within its relationships, and raising the next generation far from the people who had raised you. Ancient societies seem to have understood that this transition couldn't be left to chance. The relationships between neighboring communities didn't end once a marriage took place. Gift exchanges continued, family ties were maintained across generations, trust flowed in both directions. A woman's birth community still cared about her welfare, while her new community welcomed her into an already established network of alliances. In other words, exogamy wasn't sustained by marriage alone, it was sustained by relationships. And perhaps that is one of the most overlooked achievements of ancient human society. Their success wasn't built simply on moving people from one group to another. It was built on creating communities strong enough to make those life-changing journeys possible, generation after generation. Without that support, the entire system would have collapsed. With it, our ancestors protected both their social bonds and their genetic future for thousands of years. So, what does all of this really tell us? It tells us that ancient humans solved one of the most difficult reproductive challenges their species would ever face without understanding a single gene, chromosome, or DNA molecule. They had no textbooks to study, no genetic counselors to guide them, and no scientific language to explain why close relatives should avoid having children together. Yet they found the answer anyway. Not through one brilliant discovery, but through a remarkably layered system that combined instinct, learned behavior, social traditions, and cultural rules. Each layer compensated for the limits of the others. The Westermark effect created an unconscious aversion between children who grew up together. Cultural taboos reinforced that instinct and extended its reach. Exogamy encouraged people to build families beyond their own communities. Seasonal gatherings created opportunities to meet unrelated partners. Long-distance trade and gift exchanges kept neighboring groups connected across generations. Kinship systems clarified which relationships were appropriate, while patterns such as female exogamy and patrilocal residence quietly shaped the genetic diversity that scientists can still detect in ancient DNA today. None of these pieces worked in isolation. Together, they formed an incredibly sophisticated survival strategy. Personally, I think that's what makes this story so extraordinary. We often imagine evolution as something that happens only inside the body. Stronger muscles, larger brains, better endurance. But some of humanity's greatest adaptations never appeared in our skeletons at all. They existed in our relationships, in the invisible rules that encouraged people to cooperate, trust strangers, and think beyond the needs of a single generation. Ancient humans didn't simply evolve biologically, they evolved socially, and that may have been just as important. More importantly, these systems were not temporary solutions. Communities preserved them because they worked. Generation after generation, people could see the difference between groups that remained connected and groups that became isolated. One path protected diversity, the other slowly increased vulnerability. They may never have understood the genetics behind those outcomes, but they understood the results well enough to keep passing these traditions forward. Now, let's return to your group of 23 people. Remember the young woman who kept noticing the young man from the neighboring valley during the last 2 seasonal gatherings? That wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the system quietly doing exactly what it had been shaped to do. Her family already knows his community. Gifts have been exchanged for years. Trust has been built across generations. When the time comes, both groups will support the partnership, turning a personal relationship into a connection between 2 entire communities. A new family begins. Fresh genetic diversity enters the group. Another generation grows up healthier than it otherwise might have. And the cycle continues. Perhaps that's the most surprising lesson of all. Ancient humans didn't survive simply because they hunted better, fought harder, or endured harsher winters than every other species around them. They survived because they learned that the future of their own community often depended on reaching beyond it. Long before science could explain the danger of inbreeding, our ancestors had already built societies capable of preventing it. And thousands of generations later, the fact that we're here to tell this story may be one of the strongest pieces of evidence that they got it right.